Welcome back. Tonight, let's take a journey back in time to the Middle Ages. We'll try to imagine a single day in that era and find out why you might not last very long. But before we begin, I want to thank you for your support. If you enjoy content like this, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons to help the channel grow. Now, let's begin our journey. The morning in a medieval village was not a moment of quiet serenity, but a slow, gradual awakening to the demanding realities of life. There was no rooster to crow, for the roosters of the past were not so punctual. Instead, the first signs of a new day were the subtle shifts in the air, the biting cold of a winter morning, or the fresh, damp chill of a spring dawn seeping through the cracks in the wattle and daub walls of a small hut. For a peasant family, the night was a brief, communal affair, spent huddled together on straw-filled sacks laid on the dirt floor, sharing body heat against the relentless cold. The home itself was little more than a single, low-ceilinged room, a smouldering fire in the central hearth, the source of both warmth and light, filled the air with smoke that clung to the thatched roof and the rough-hewn timbers. There were no windows, only a small hole in the roof to let out some of the smoke, which meant the interior was often dim, even at midday. It was a place of functionality, not comfort. A simple, sturdy table and a few stools were the only furniture of note, serving for both meals and any other indoor work. Privacy was a concept as foreign as the lands across the sea. The family lived, ate and slept within a few short steps of each other, in a space that might also be shared with a few chickens or a pig during the most frigid months. The first person to stir would be the head of the household, a man whose hands were already calloused from a lifetime of labor. His first task was to stoke the embers of the fire, coaxing them back to life with a few dry sticks and a gentle breath. As the fire crackled, a pale, flickering light would finally fill the room. The children, still sleepy, would begin to stir, the youngest perhaps whimpering, while the wife would start preparing the first meal of the day. This meal was a simple and unvaried affair. There were no fresh eggs, no bacon, no fruits. Instead, a thick, watery porridge would be cooked over the open flame, often made from oats or barley, sometimes with a few beans or onions mixed in. This was food for sustenance, not pleasure. It was meant to fill the stomach, to provide enough energy to endure the long hours of physical labor ahead. A piece of hard, rye bread, often baked communally, would be broken and shared among the family. Their drink, for both adults and children, was a weak, fermented ale or cider. This was not for intoxication, but for safety. The local water sources were often contaminated with waste, and the process of brewing and fermenting helped to kill the harmful bacteria, making it a far safer option. As the family ate, they would prepare for the day. Clothes were simple, tunics of coarse wool or linen, often patched and mended over and over again. There were no shoes in the modern sense. Simple leather boots or bare feet were the norm. The air was perpetually dusty and smoky, and a clean body was a luxury. Personal hygiene was a far cry from today's standards. A quick wash of the hands and face with cold, often murky water from a nearby well was the most one could hope for. The concept of daily bathing or changing clothes was non-existent. With the meal finished and the sun now beginning to cast a weak grey light over the land, it was time to leave the warmth of the hut. The peasant would grab his tools, a heavy wooden hoe or a simple digging stick, and gather his family. The children, still young, had their own tasks. A boy might be sent to watch the sheep, a girl to fetch water or tend to a small garden plot behind the house. They would walk out into the cold morning air, past the neighbouring huts, and towards the vast, open fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. These fields were not their own, but belonged to the lord of the manor, and on this land their entire existence depended. The long, silent march towards the day's labour began, a routine of toil that would repeat itself with the rising and setting of the sun, day after day, week after week, year after year. This was the start of a medieval peasant's day, a journey not of a few miles, but of 1,000 years, a glimpse into a life defined by hardship, simplicity, and the quiet, persistent will to survive. The journey from the small, smoky hut to the open fields was not a long one, but it was a journey from the intimate space of family to the vast, unforgiving expanse of nature. As the peasant and his family walked, their feet sinking into the muddy tracks, the air grew colder and fresher, carrying with it the sense of damp earth and the promise of the day's immense labour. The fields, stretching as far as the eye could see, were not their own. They were the property of the local lord, and the peasant's very right to exist and to grow a meagre portion of food for his family was contingent on his tireless work on the lord's behalf. The work began in the early spring, with the arrival of a season that was less about rebirth and more about a desperate race against time. The most crucial task was ploughing. With a simple, heavy wooden plough, often tipped with a piece of iron, the peasant would begin to turn the soil. This was a Herculean effort. Without powerful draft horses, the plough was often pulled by a team of slow, stubborn oxen, or, in the poorest of households, by the peasant and his family themselves. The furrows had to be straight and deep, a painstaking process that demanded both strength and precision. The clods of earth were heavy and resistant, and the sound of the plough cutting through the soil was a slow, grinding rhythm that would define the peasant's entire day. After the ploughing came the sowing. With a pouch of grain slung over his shoulder, the peasant would walk the length of the field, casting seeds by hand in a practiced, rhythmic motion. This was a task that required an immense amount of faith that the seeds would take root, that the rain would come at the right time, and that the pests would stay away. It was a physical manifestation of hope and a silent prayer for a bountiful harvest that would ensure survival for another year. The summer months brought a different kind of labour. The fields, now green with young crops, had to be constantly tended to. Weeding was a relentless task, often performed by the women and children of the family. Hunched over in the relentless sun, they would pull weeds by hand or with a simple hoe, a monotonous and back-breaking job that stretched from sunrise to sunset. They were in a constant battle against the natural world, trying to ensure that every ounce of a crop's energy went to the harvest, not to the weeds that choked it. The tools of this era were as simple and brutal as the work itself. The sickle, a small curved blade, was used to cut individual stalks of grain. The scythe, a much larger sweeping blade, was used for cutting down hay. There were no motors, no engines, no mechanical aid of any kind. Every movement, every cut, every furrow was powered by human muscle, fueled by a meager diet. The constant repetition of these motions led to calloused hands, aching backs, and a body that aged far beyond its years. The work was long, the day punctuated only by brief, hurried meals. Lunch was often a piece of hard bread, a chunk of cheese, or a few salted onions, all consumed while sitting on the edge of the very field they were working. There was no time for rest or conversation. Every moment of daylight was precious, a resource to be exploited to its fullest. The most crucial time of the year was the harvest, a frantic communal effort that demanded every ounce of energy from the entire village. The crops, ripe and ready, had to be brought in before the first frost, before the winter rains ruined them. This was a time of frenzied activity, a mixture of both exhaustion and a desperate sense of relief that the food for the coming year was finally being gathered. After the harvest, the work was not over. The fields had to be prepared for the next season, the grain threshed and stored, and the tools mended. As the sun began its long descent, painting the sky in a final, fiery show of colour, the peasant's day in the fields would come to a close. His body, now heavy with fatigue, ached in protest with every step. The walk back to the village was a slow, silent procession of exhausted figures, their silhouettes long and distorted against the setting sun. They were walking towards the dim glow of their hearths, their only true source of warmth and comfort, knowing that after a short, fitful sleep, they would return to this very spot to repeat the same grinding labour all over again. This was the rhythm of a peasant's life, a monotonous and demanding cycle dictated by the seasons and the land. It was a life of constant toil, where the line between working and surviving was thin, and the reward for an entire year's labour was simply the chance to do it all over again. For the medieval peasant, the reward for a day of grueling, back-breaking labour was not a comfortable evening of rest, but a simple, repetitive meal. The food on their plate was a direct reflection of the land they toiled and the seasons that governed their lives. This was a world where sustenance was the primary goal, and culinary delight was an alien, aristocratic concept. At the very heart of the peasant's diet were two staples, bread and pottage. The bread was a dense, dark loaf, often made from coarse grains like barley or rye, with a mix of husks and chaff. It was heavy, hard, and nourishing, meant to fill the stomach and provide slow-burning energy for the next day's work. It was not a luxury, but a necessity, a constant presence at every meal. Pottage, on the other hand, was a thick, savoury stew that was the centrepiece of the peasant's cooking. It was prepared in a single large cauldron, suspended over the hearth fire. This cauldron was a fixture of the home, a vessel that was rarely emptied, with new ingredients simply added on top of the old. The pottage was a simple yet vital concoction, usually made from whatever was on hand: peas, beans, root vegetables like carrots or parsnips, and wild herbs. It was a monotonous meal, with very little flavour variety from day to day, but it provided the bulk of a peasant's daily sustenance. To supplement their pottage and bread, peasants often maintained a small garden plot adjacent to their huts. Here they would grow a few essential vegetables: cabbage, onions, and leeks. These small gardens were the family's lifeline, providing a small but reliable source of fresh food that could be harvested throughout the year. The true luxury, the food of dreams and special occasions, was meat. For the vast majority of peasants, meat was a rarity. The animals they raised, pigs, chickens, and cows, were far too valuable as working animals or producers of eggs and milk to be slaughtered for daily consumption. When a pig was finally butchered, often in the late autumn, it was an event. Every part of the animal was used, and the meat was salted, smoked, or dried to preserve it for as long as possible. The concept of buying a cut of meat at a market was an impossibility for most. Fishing was another potential source of food, but access to rivers and streams was often controlled by the lord. Poaching, the act of illegally hunting or fishing on the lord's land, was a serious crime, punishable by brutal and swift justice. It was a risk many took in times of desperation, but a dangerous one. Cooking was a simple and rustic affair. With the central hearth as their only kitchen, food was either boiled in the pottage pot or baked in a communal oven shared by the entire village. Spices, which were highly sought after and traded along vast routes, were far too expensive for the peasant's purse. The food was bland and unseasoned, its only flavors coming from the basic vegetables and herbs. The diet of a medieval peasant was one of constant undernourishment. While they consumed enough calories to survive, their diet lacked the vitamins and nutrients we now know are essential for health. This made them vulnerable to a host of diseases and infections. The greatest fear surrounding food was not its blandness, but its absence. The period between the spring, when the last of the winter's stored food was running out, and the late summer harvest was known as the hungry gap. It was a time of immense anxiety, when food supplies were at their lowest and the threat of famine loomed large. A failed harvest could mean not just hunger, but starvation for an entire village. As the day's hard work in the fields came to an end, the evening meal was a quiet, tired affair. It was not a time for conversation or celebration, but a final act of sustenance before a long night of sleep. A bowl of thick pottage, a piece of bread, and a cup of ale. This was the peasant's plate, a simple yet profound reminder of a life that was lived in constant proximity to the land and in constant battle against the empty ache of hunger. For all its physical hardship and endless labor, the life of a medieval peasant was not one of complete isolation. The rhythm of their days was not just dictated by the sun and the seasons, but by the powerful guiding presence of the church and the close-knit bonds of their village community. The stone church, with its spire reaching towards the heavens, was more than just a place of worship. It was the social, spiritual, and physical heart of their world. The sound of the church bell was the village's clock, marking the hours for prayer and work. Mass was a central weekly event, a time when the entire community would gather under one roof. The service, conducted in Latin, was often incomprehensible to the average peasant, but its rituals, its music, and the presence of their neighbours provided a sense of comfort and order in a world that was otherwise chaotic and unpredictable. The village priest was a figure of immense authority, not only guiding them spiritually, but also serving as a source of news, a scribe for the illiterate, and often a moral compass for the community. The Christian calendar provided the only real breaks from the unyielding toil of the fields. Feasts and holy days were eagerly anticipated, offering rare moments of rest in celebration. Christmas was not a time of commercial bustle, but a period of profound spiritual reflection, marked by church services, communal feasting on what little they had, and a brief cessation of work. Easter, celebrating the resurrection, was a time of joyous hope, a stark contrast to the darkness and deprivation of winter. These holidays were woven into the very fabric of their existence, giving them something to look forward to and providing a much-needed psychological respite. But beyond formal religion, the peasants' worldview was also shaped by a rich tapestry of superstition and folklore. For a people who could not explain natural phenomena with science, stories of fairies, spirits, and malicious imps provided a framework for understanding the world. They believed in omens and charms, in the protective power of certain herbs and prayers against evil spirits, and in the magic that was believed to exist in the deep woods and ancient stones. This blend of formal Christianity and deep-seated folklore offered a complete explanation for everything from a bad harvest to a sudden illness. Evenings after the day's back-breaking work was done were not always silent. Families would gather around the hearth fire to tell stories, to mend their simple tools, or to sing the old songs. Sometimes a few men would gather at the village alehouse, a small, simple building where the weak, smoky ale was a welcome comfort. Here they would share tales of the day's work, trade gossip, and find a brief, fleeting moment of camaraderie. These simple gatherings were a vital part of their social lives, a way to connect and to feel a part of something larger than their own struggle. The end of the day often concluded with a final prayer, a quiet moment of gratitude for the day's survival, and a plea for protection for the night that come. The life of a medieval peasant was a constant, tiring negotiation with the physical world, but it was their community and their unwavering belief that gave their struggles meaning. It provided them with an identity beyond being mere labourers, a connection to a shared past and a hope for a better future, in a world where hope was often the only thing they had. With our first topic now complete, we've explored the very foundations of medieval life, from the dawn's first light to the last flickering embers of the fire. But the medieval world was not just endless fields and small villages. In our next journey, we will leave the peaceful quiet of the countryside and travel to a place that was louder, smellier, and far more chaotic, the medieval city. Having spent our time immersed in the quiet, cyclical rhythm of the peasant's world, we now turn our attention to a place that existed as its opposite, the medieval city. Leaving behind the familiar fields and the smoke-filled village huts, our journey takes us down a rutted, muddy path that gradually widens and becomes more crowded. In the distance, the first signs of the city emerge, not as a skyline of tall buildings, but as a dense, low-slung cluster of rooftops, all huddled together behind a formidable stone wall. As we draw closer, the gentle sounds of the countryside are slowly replaced by a new, more aggressive symphony. The air itself changes. It loses its fresh, earthy scent and is replaced by a complex, overwhelming mixture of odours. The first gate in the city wall, a heavy, timber-framed structure, acts as a bottleneck, with carts, livestock, and people all jostling for position. Stepping through it is like crossing a threshold into a different world entirely. The streets, which seemed so open from a distance, are now revealed to be narrow, winding alleys, darkened by the overhanging upper floors of the timber-framed houses. The first thing that strikes you is the sheer, unyielding noise. The silence of the fields is a distant memory. Now you are surrounded by a constant cacophony. The shouts of street vendors hawking their wares, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby forge, the cries of children playing a rough game in the street, and the lowing of a herd of pigs being driven to market. The air hums with 1,000 different voices, all blending into a single overwhelming sound that would be utterly alien to a person from the countryside. But the most unforgettable aspect of the medieval city, the one that would assault your senses with the most brutal force, was the smell. It was an odor that was a permanent fixture, an all-encompassing presence that permeated every corner of the city. The unpaved streets were not just muddy, they were a slurry of human and animal waste and rotting refuse. There were no sanitation systems. Waste was often simply thrown out of an upper-story window, a common practice that made walking the streets a treacherous endeavor. The city's industries only added to the stench. The tanneries, which processed animal hides, were particularly pungent, their vats of putrid chemicals and decaying flesh a foul cloud that hung over the entire district. The butcher's stools, filled with blood and offal, attracted swarms of flies. The air was thick with smoke from countless chimneys, burning everything from wood to charcoal. It was an aroma that told a story of a city living in close, often brutal proximity to its own filth. It was an odor that by today's standards would be utterly unbearable, but for the citizens of the time, it was simply the scent of life. The sights were equally overwhelming. The streets were not just crowded, but a chaotic swirl of different social classes. Beggars with tattered rags and open sores sat beside merchants in rich, colourful wool, and the occasional armoured soldier on a horse would force everyone to scramble out of the way. The houses themselves were a jumble of styles and ages, their upper floors often jutting out over the street below, creating a permanent twilight in the narrow alleys. Signs for various trades, a leather belt for a cobbler, a horseshoe for a blacksmith, hung from the buildings, competing for attention in a visual cacophony. This was the medieval city, a place of immense energy and a terrifying lack of sanitation. It was a world that, to a person from our modern time, would feel like a constant, unforgiving assault on all the senses. It was a place where a person's very senses would be overwhelmed, but where fortunes could be made and lost, and where a different kind of daily grind unfolded every single day. This sensory overload, this chaotic tapestry of sight, sound and smell was just the surface. In our next segment, we will delve into the very engine of this urban world to explore the bustling heart of commerce, the medieval market. The cacophony of the city streets, the overwhelming smells and the crush of bodies all led to a single bustling centre, the marketplace. This was the city's heart, a place where the lifeblood of commerce flowed with a constant, energetic pulse. For a person accustomed to the quiet bartering of a small village market, the scale and sheer variety of the medieval city market would have been a bewildering, fascinating spectacle. Here, everything was for sale. There were stalls piled high with fresh produce brought in from the countryside, fragrant with the smell of newly cut hay and ripe vegetables. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats and fresh bread from the baker's stands, offering a tantalizing contrast to the usual peasant's diet. Beyond the food, there were vendors selling goods from across the known world: fine wools from Flanders, intricate leather goods from a local tanner, and the most exotic and expensive goods of all: spices, silk, and porcelain that had travelled thousands of miles along the legendary trade routes from the east. The merchants who ran these stalls were a world away from the simple farmers of the countryside. They were a new class of people, defined not by the land they owned, but by the wealth they acquired. They ranged from small-time peddlers who walked the streets selling simple trinkets and mending pots and pans, to powerful, wealthy traders who had ships and warehouses and dealt in fortunes. Their lives were a constant negotiation, a dance of haggling and deal-making that was as complex and demanding as any battle. This was a world that ran on coin, a concept more abstract than the tangible grain and livestock of the village. And where there was money, there were also money changers. These figures sat at their tables, their hands moving with practiced ease as they weighed and counted coins from different kingdoms and regions. Their presence was a testament to the city's global connections, a quiet acknowledgement that the city was a hub for trade that stretched far beyond its walls. But the marketplace was not a chaotic free-for-all. It was an organized system, controlled and regulated by powerful institutions known as guilds. Guilds were the foundations of the urban economy. They were associations of craftsmen and merchants who specialized in a particular trade, such as shoemakers, weavers, bakers, or blacksmiths. Their power was immense. They controlled who could practice a trade, how goods were made, and at what price they were sold. The guild system was a strict hierarchy, a path that a young person had to follow from start to finish. It began with an apprentice, a boy who would live and work with a master craftsman for several years, learning the trade from the ground up. The apprentice received no pay, only food and shelter, but in return, he was taught a valuable skill. After his apprenticeship, he became a journeyman, a skilled worker who was paid a wage. The journeyman traveled from city to city, working for different masters and perfecting his craft. His ultimate goal was to create a masterpiece, a final work of skill that would, if approved by the guild, earn him the title of master and the right to open his own workshop. The guild's rules were not just about money, they were also about quality and reputation. They enforced strict standards for craftsmanship to ensure that their members' goods were of the highest quality. This was a form of quality control in an age without trademarks or government regulations. Cheating the customer with shoddy workmanship could lead to heavy fines or, in the most severe cases, expulsion from the guild, which was a professional death sentence. The guild's halls were often some of the most impressive buildings in the city, standing as a physical testament to their power and wealth. They were not just economic institutions, but also social and religious ones, providing a safety net for their members and organizing communal feasts and religious ceremonies. For a young person in the city, the dream of becoming a master craftsman was the highest form of social mobility, a path to a life of relative comfort and respect that was utterly unattainable in the countryside. As the sun began its descent and the shadows grew long, the marketplace would slowly begin to empty. The stalls would be packed away, the cries of the vendors would fade, and the city would take on a different, quieter character. But the legacy of the merchants and the power of the guilds would remain, the invisible engine of a bustling urban world, an intricate web of commerce and control that had created a new kind of society, with its own rules, its own hierarchy, and its own unique set of struggles. In our next segment, we will turn our attention to the darker side of this urban world, to the chaotic and brutal system of crime and punishment. Beyond the organized chaos of the marketplace and the structured world of the guilds, the medieval city had a darker, more precarious side. This was a place where law and order were fragile concepts, and a person's safety was never truly guaranteed. In a world without a formal, professional police force, justice was often a brutal, public spectacle, intended to instill fear and enforce a rigid social order. There was no dedicated police force patrolling the streets. Instead, Order was maintained by a system of night watches, a rotating group of citizens who walked the streets after dark, and by local constables, who were often just ordinary men with a bit of authority. This meant that for a large part of the day, and even at night, the streets were left to the whims of thieves, cutthroats, and opportunists. The crimes of the city were varied, from the petty to the truly horrific. Petty theft and pickpocketing were common, a constant danger in the crowded markets and narrow streets. Cheating customers by shortchanging them or selling them shoddy goods was a regular offence, often policed by the guilds themselves. More serious crimes, such as robbery and assault, were frequent, and without streetlights, the city's alleys became dangerous places after dark. The most severe crimes, including murder, arson, and treason, were a constant fear, a grim reminder of the thin line between order and chaos. When a crime was committed and the perpetrator was caught, the path to justice was swift and often unforgiving. There were no hidden courtrooms or private prisons. The justice system was a public event, a form of grim theatre meant to be a powerful deterrent for anyone who might be considering a life of crime. The punishment was often physical and designed to be a memorable, painful lesson. For lesser crimes, the most common forms of punishment involved public humiliation. The pillory and the stocks were fixtures in the city's main square. An offender, locked in one of these devices for a day or two, would be exposed to the jeers and taunts of the crowd. They might be pelted with rotten vegetables, mud, or stones, a humiliating and often painful experience that would mark them as a criminal to the entire community. For a baker who sold underweight bread, or a merchant who cheated his customers, this was a powerful form of social control. More serious crimes or repeated offences were met with harsher punishments. Whipping in the town square was a common practice, a brutal and painful form of corporal punishment. Mutilation was also used, its severity depending on the crime. A thief might have their hand cut off, while a person who lied or spread slander might have their tongue pierced or their ears cut off. These punishments were not just about pain, they were about marking the criminal for life, a permanent warning to both the offender and the public. For the gravest of crimes, the punishment was death. Hanging was a common form of capital punishment for crimes like murder and robbery. For crimes against the state or the church, such as heresy or treason, the punishment was often more brutal and theatrical, such as being burned at the stake. These executions were public holidays, drawing huge crowds who came to witness the spectacle of justice being served. The concept of a fair trial as we know it today was often non-existent. A person accused of a crime might be subjected to a trial by ordeal. In this bizarre and superstitious form of justice, the accused person's innocence or guilt was believed to be determined by divine intervention. A common ordeal was the trial by hot iron, where the accused person had to carry a red-hot iron for a few paces. If their hand healed quickly, it was believed they were innocent. If it festered, they were considered guilty. It was a brutal and arbitrary system that had more to do with faith than with fact. This brutal public system of justice was a necessary part of city life, a fragile framework that held the dense, chaotic population together. It was a world without empathy or mercy, where the rule of law was enforced not through a quiet process of due diligence, but through a loud, painful, and often very public display of power. It was a constant reminder that, in the medieval city, a person's life and limb were never truly secure, and that the order of the day was maintained not just by the merchants and the guilds, but by the fear of a merciless and all-seeing justice. In our next segment, we will leave the public spaces and step inside the crowded, chaotic homes of the city dwellers. From the chaotic energy of the public square and the brutal justice of the city streets, our attention now turns to a different kind of space, the medieval urban home. While the city's exterior was a swirling mass of people and noise, The houses themselves were a collection of small, private worlds, each one a testament to the crowded, vertical nature of city life. The most iconic image of a medieval city is its rows of timber-framed houses. These buildings were constructed with a visible skeleton of wooden beams, and the spaces in between were filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks and mud. The most distinctive feature was the jetty, the upper floors that jutted out over the street below. This architectural style was not for aesthetics, it was a practical solution to a pressing problem. By building out over the street, citizens could gain more living space on the upper floors without having to pay for a larger footprint of land below. The result was a maze of shadowy, overhung streets, a permanent twilight cast by the encroaching buildings. Unlike the peasant's one-room hut, the urban home was a multi-story affair, a vertical stack of different functions. The ground floor was typically a shop or a workshop, open to the street, where the master craftsman or merchant would conduct his business. Behind this shop might be a small kitchen and a storage area. The upper floors were reserved for the family's living quarters, a series of small, cramped rooms that served as bedrooms, a dining area, and a parlor for receiving guests. For a person of means, this multi-story house represented a new kind of social status, a stark contrast to the horizontal, earthbound existence of the countryside. Even with multiple floors, space was a precious commodity. Families were often large, and it was not uncommon for a master, his wife, children, apprentices, and servants to all live under one roof. Privacy was a luxury unknown to all but the wealthiest. Rooms were multifunctional, with a single space serving as a dining room by day and a sleeping chamber by night. The beds themselves, while more comfortable than a peasant's straw sack, were still simple affairs. A wooden frame with a mattress filled with feathers, straw, or even rags. Heating and cooking still revolved around the open fire. In the peasant's home, the smoke would fill the room, but in the urban home, there was often a chimney, a slightly more sophisticated way to vent the smoke away. However, the use of open flame in buildings made of wood was a constant and terrifying risk. Fires were a regular occurrence in medieval cities, and a single blaze in a crowded neighborhood could quickly turn into a city-wide catastrophe. The fear of fire was a constant, low-level anxiety that permeated city life. Sanitation within these homes was non-existent by today's standards. There were no indoor bathrooms or plumbing. Waste was collected in chamber pots, which were then emptied directly from an upper window into the street below, often with a simple shout of "Garde à l'eau," a corruption of the French "Garde à l'eau," or "Watch out for the water." This was a common everyday practice that contributed to the unbearable stench of the city streets. Water had to be fetched from a public well or a communal water pump, a daily chore that was often the responsibility of the women and servants. The water was often of questionable quality, and disease was a constant threat. The crowded, unhygienic conditions of urban living made cities breeding grounds for epidemics that could wipe out large portions of the population with terrifying speed. Despite these grim realities, the urban home was a place of work, family, and a new kind of aspiration. It was a space that was both a sanctuary from the chaos of the streets and a hub of commercial activity. It was here, within these cramped, timber-framed walls, that a new kind of social class was born, a class of merchants and craftsmen who, through their hard work and skill, were building a life of relative comfort and a future for their families. As we conclude our exploration of the medieval city, we'll now turn our attention to an even more rarefied world, a world of unimaginable wealth, power, and intrigue. We leave behind the sounds of the street and enter the hushed ceremonial halls of the noble court. Having navigated the crowded streets and cramped homes of the medieval city, we now turn our attention to one of the most perilous aspects of life in the Middle Ages: health. The medieval body was a fragile thing, constantly under threat from infection, injury, and disease. In a world with no concept of germs or viruses, the understanding of illness was entirely different, a complex mixture of ancient Greek theory, folk wisdom, and deep-seated superstition. The dominant medical philosophy of the time was the theory of the four humours. It was believed that the human body was composed of four fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A person's health was determined by the balance of these humours. Too much phlegm might make you lethargic, while an excess of yellow bile could make you quick to anger. Illness was therefore not caused by an outside invader, but by an internal imbalance, and the goal of all medicine was to restore this harmony. For the common person, whether in the city or the countryside, the first point of contact for any ailment was not a doctor in the modern sense, but a local healer. This figure was often a woman, sometimes called a wise woman or a cunning woman, whose knowledge of herbs and natural remedies was passed down through generations. She was a central and trusted member of the community, a person you would turn to for everything from a fever to a broken bone, and her skills were as much about tradition as they were about science. The healer's primary tools were plants. Medieval herbalism was a rich and detailed body of knowledge, with an encyclopedia of plants and their supposed medicinal properties. They would use willow bark for fevers and pain, a remedy that we now know contains an active ingredient similar to aspirin. They might use valerian root to help with sleep, or chamomile to soothe an upset stomach. These remedies, while sometimes effective, were a matter of trial and error, of tradition and belief. The dose was often inexact, and the result was far from guaranteed. This herbal knowledge was inextricably linked with superstition and folk magic. A healer might not only prescribe an herbal tea, but also give you an amulet to wear or instruct you to recite a specific prayer. Illness was often viewed as the work of evil spirits, a curse from a witch, or a divine punishment. Therefore, the cure had to address both the physical and the spiritual. A person with a fever might be given a tea made from feverfew, but they would also be told to place a charm under their pillow to ward off the sickness. The boundaries between medicine and magic were blurred, and for the patient, it was often impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. This folk medicine was a far cry from modern healthcare. For simple ailments, it may have provided some comfort and a placebo effect, but for anything serious, it was often entirely ineffective. A simple infection from a cut, which would be a minor inconvenience today, could easily lead to a debilitating illness or a swift death. Without a concept of hygiene, many of the very remedies meant to heal a person could introduce new diseases. In this world, the body was a fragile vessel, and life was a delicate balance. A sudden cough, a fever, or a pain in the stomach was not a temporary setback, but a serious threat, a moment of profound uncertainty. The local healer, with her knowledge of herbs and her belief in the unseen forces of the world, was a source of hope in a time of great fear. A quiet guardian in a world where a person's life could be extinguished by a sickness that we now know is no more than a common cold. In our next segment, we will explore the more brutal and often terrifying side of medieval medicine, the realm of the barber surgeon. Where the local healer relied on the quiet wisdom of plants and the comfort, tradition, another figure in the medieval world practiced a different, more brutal form of medicine. This was the barber surgeon, a person whose trade was not just hair cutting and shaving, but also a variety of grisly surgical procedures. The sign of their trade was a striped pole of red and white, a symbol of the very blood and bandages that defined their work. The barber-surgeon was not a university-educated physician, but a craftsman. They were trained through apprenticeships, and their skills were a crude mix of practical knowledge and a great deal of daring. A barber-surgeon was the person you would go to for a tooth extraction, a quick haircut, and most importantly, for a procedure that was considered the cure for almost every ailment: bloodletting. The practice of bloodletting was rooted in the ancient theory that illness was caused by an excess of one of the four humours. The solution, therefore, was to drain the body of this bad blood to restore balance. This was not a rare procedure. It was a common, everyday medical practice, performed on everyone from the common peasant to the highest-ranking noble. The barber-surgeon would use a sharp lancet or razor to open a vein, allowing a specified amount of blood to drain into a bowl. The procedure was often done in the public square, a small yet intimate spectacle that was a part of daily life. But the barber-surgeon's work extended far beyond bloodletting. In a world without antibiotics, infections from even a minor wound could quickly turn into a fatal condition. When a limb became gangrenous and an infection threatened to spread, the only solution was amputation. This was a truly horrifying procedure, performed without the benefit of anesthesia. The patient, fully conscious, would be held down while the barber-surgeon, with a saw or a large knife, would sever the infected limb. To stop the bleeding afterward, a hot iron would be used to cauterize the wound, a painful and terrifying final step. The scream of the patient, a constant feature of the barber-surgeon's work, was a sound that all in the community learned to fear. The barber-surgeon also performed a crude form of dentistry. A person with a severe toothache had only one option: a visit to the barber-surgeon to have the tooth pulled. With a pair of simple, heavy pliers, the tooth would be extracted with force. The pain was excruciating, and the risk of infection was high, a grim yet necessary exchange for temporary relief. Their tools were as brutal as their methods. Saws, knives, forceps, and a variety of strange-looking metal hooks and clamps were the instruments of their trade. These tools were never sterilized. The same saw used to cut through a rotten piece of wood might be used to amputate a limb, and the same razor used to shave a man's face might be used to open a vein for bloodletting. The concept of germs was entirely unknown. The surgeon's hands, his tools, and the very environment in which he worked were breeding grounds for the bacteria that would inevitably lead to a post-operative infection. This was the terrifying reality of medieval surgery. It was a world where a person's life was often saved not by the skill of the surgeon, but by a stroke of luck and the sheer strength of their own body to fight off the inevitable infection. The barber-surgeon was a necessary figure, a last resort in a world of desperate ailments, but their work was a testament to the brutal, unsanitary, and often deadly state of medieval medicine. It was a world where a simple cut could be a death sentence, and where the cure was often as terrifying as the disease itself. This fear of sickness was a constant underlying current in medieval life, a current that would soon become a tidal wave of unimaginable proportions. In our next segment, we will confront the most devastating medical catastrophe in human history, the arrival of the Black Death. The daily fears of a medieval person, a small cut becoming infected, a fever taking hold, were all individual battles against a fragile body. But in the mid-14th century, Europe would face a sickness of unimaginable scale, a silent, terrifying force that would sweep across the continent, wiping out entire villages and forever changing the course of history. This was the Black Death. It arrived, silently and unseen, carried on the trade ships that sailed from the east. The ships, laden with spices and silks, also carried another cargo, black rats infested with fleas. These fleas carried a bacteria that would come to be known as Yersinia pestis. In the cramped, unsanitary ports of the Mediterranean, the disease found a perfect breeding ground. It spread from the fleas to the rats, and from the rats to the people, and from there it moved with a horrifying, unstoppable speed. The symptoms were swift and gruesome. A person who was healthy in the morning could be dead by the evening. The first signs were a high fever, chills, and a terrible headache. Soon, the most telltale symptom would appear. Black, swollen, painful lumps called buboes would form in the groin, the armpits, and the neck. These swellings, filled with pus and blood, were a visible sign of the disease taking hold. The buboes would burst, or the victim would succumb to internal hemorrhaging, a process that stained the skin black, earning the disease its grim name. For a people who believed in the theory of the four humours and saw illness as a matter of internal imbalance, the plague was incomprehensible. They had no idea what was causing it. The explanations were as varied as they were desperate. Some believed it was a punishment from God for humanity's sins. Others blamed it on a sinister alignment of the planets. There were those who believed the very air itself had been corrupted by a poisonous mist, a theory known as miasma theory. Still others turned to horrifying scapegoats, blaming Jewish communities and accusing them of poisoning the wells. The cures were as futile as the explanations. People tried everything from wearing foul-smelling herbs around their necks to ward off the bad air, to self-flagellation, whipping themselves publicly to atone for their sins and appease an angry God. Desperate families would abandon their sick loved ones, and entire villages would flee in panic, only to carry the disease with them to the next town. Nothing seemed to work. The social fabric of the medieval world began to unravel. Law and order broke down. Priests refused to give last rites, and doctors fled in terror. There were not enough people left alive to bury the dead, and bodies were often thrown into mass, unmarked graves. The plague did not discriminate. It killed the rich and the poor, the young and the old, the healthy and the weak. It shattered the very foundations of feudal society, as a world built on labour suddenly found its labour force cut in half. But in the aftermath, a strange new world emerged. For the survivors, life was profoundly changed. With so many people gone, land became more available, and the labour that was left became more valuable. A peasant could suddenly demand a higher wage or a better lease, and the power dynamic between the lord and his serfs began to shift. The Black Death was not just a medical disaster, it was a societal reset, a violent, tragic event that would eventually give birth to a new way of thinking and a new kind of world. It was a terrifying chapter in human history, a testament to the sheer fragility of life in the Middle Ages, and a grim reminder that death, a constant companion, could arrive not just in the form of an injury or an illness, but as an invisible, unstoppable wave. In our next segment, we will explore this final, inescapable reality, delving into the medieval person's view of death and the rituals surrounding it. After confronting the terrifying, sweeping scale of the plague, we now turn our attention to death on a more personal level. For the medieval person, death was not a distant abstraction. It was a constant presence, a familiar companion that was deeply intertwined with the rhythm of life. It was a reality of infancy, a result of common illnesses, and an outcome of a life lived in constant proximity to hardship. In this world, the rituals surrounding death were not just a formality, but a profound and vital part of the cultural and spiritual landscape. The process of dying was a community event. When a person was nearing their end, family and friends would gather at their bedside, offering comfort and prayers. The central figure in this final moment was the village priest, who would administer the last rites, a sacred ritual that included confession and extreme unction, a final anointing with holy oil. This ritual was believed to prepare the soul for its journey to the afterlife. The hope of salvation, of a life free from the pains and toils of their earthly existence, was a powerful source of comfort and a final, desperate prayer. After death, the body was prepared for its final rest. It would be washed and dressed in a simple linen shroud. A wake, a period of time where the body was laid out in the home, would be held. During this time, family and neighbors would gather to offer their respects, to pray and to keep a vigil over the deceased. This communal grieving process was an important part of medieval life, a final act of human connection in the face of death's finality. The funeral itself was a public procession. The body, often carried on a simple bier, would be taken from the home to the local church. The procession would be accompanied by a choir of mourners, their hymns a mournful soundtrack to the village's collective sorrow. The destination was the churchyard, the sacred ground surrounding the church itself. Burial in this consecrated ground was of immense importance, as it was believed to be the place where the body would rest until the day of resurrection, when the soul and body would be reunited. The form of burial was a stark reflection of a person's social status. For the vast majority of peasants, the burial was a simple affair, a grave dug in the crowded churchyard, marked perhaps by a simple wooden cross that would not last for very long. For the wealthy, a burial might be in a stone-lined grave inside the church itself, or in an elaborate sarcophagus. In this final act, even in death, the social hierarchy of the medieval world was clearly visible. The medieval Christian view of the afterlife was a detailed and vivid tapestry of heaven, hell, and a place called purgatory. Heaven was the eternal reward for the righteous. Hell was the terrifying destination for the damned. But for the average person, a place of temporary atonement was believed to exist. Purgatory was a state where souls would atone for their sins before being purified and allowed to enter heaven. This belief gave rise to the practice of saying masses for the dead, a way for the living to help a loved one's soul through purgatory and into the peaceful embrace of heaven. The fear of hell and the hope of heaven were not abstract concepts. They were a powerful, tangible force that shaped every aspect of a person's life, from their daily prayers to their final moments. This worldview was so profound that an entire literary and artistic genre, known as the ars moriendi, or the art of dying, emerged, offering guidance on how to die a good death. This was a testament to the medieval person's deep-seated belief that death was not an end, but a transition, a final, crucial moment that had to be faced with dignity and piety. As we bring our discussion of medieval sickness and superstition to a close, we can see that death was not a whispered fear, but a fundamental part of the human experience, a reality that was faced with a complex blend of fear, faith, and ritual. We leave this world of illness and prayer and now ascend to a new plane of existence, a world of unimaginable wealth and power, where the dramas were not of life and death in a field, but of political intrigue, courtly love, and a very different kind of struggle for survival. Our next journey takes us into the hushed, gilded halls of the noble court. We leave behind the crowded, often brutal world of the city streets and ascend into a world of unimaginable opulence, intricate etiquette, and constant, subtle danger. This is the noble court, a place of power that existed not in the vast open fields or the bustling marketplaces, but in the hushed, echoing halls of a great castle or palace. For the vast majority of the population, this world was an abstract, distant fantasy, a place of storybooks and legends. But for the few who lived within its walls, it was a gilded cage, a stage where every single action was a performance. The royal court was the seat of power, the very heart of the kingdom. It was not a small, exclusive club, but a sprawling, complex institution, a society within a society, a universe unto itself. Hundreds or even thousands of people lived and worked within its walls, from the king and queen to their closest advisors, to the countless servants, guards and courtiers, all vying for a taste of influence. The physical space of the castle, with its great halls, private chambers and formal gardens, was the backdrop for a life that was governed by ritual and ceremony. The day of a king or queen began not with a quiet awakening, but with a highly public performance of their power. The ritual of the levee, or the royal waking, was a formal event. The most privileged courtiers would be allowed into the monarch's bedchamber to witness them rising from bed, a gesture of profound intimacy and a clear sign of their proximity to power. Their dressing was also a public spectacle, with different items of clothing handed to them by different high-ranking officials. It was a powerful, daily reminder that even the most personal acts of a monarch were a public duty, a constant, ritualized display of their authority. The etiquette of the court was a language of its own, a silent and intricate code that a person had to learn and master to survive. Every detail, from the depth of a bow or a curtsy to the specific words used when addressing a noble, was a sign of a person's rank and influence. Courtiers would spend their lives trying to move a little closer to the center of power, to gain a small advantage, to win a subtle nod of approval. The physical arrangement of the court was a constant reminder of this rigid hierarchy. A person's social standing determined where they were allowed to stand, where they were allowed to sit, and whom they were allowed to speak to. The visual spectacle of the court was designed to awe and to intimidate. The clothing of the nobles was a direct contrast to the rough, practical garb of the common people. They wore rich, colourful silks, velvets and brocades, fabrics that had been brought from distant lands at immense cost. Jewels, gold and other precious materials were a part of their daily attire. This display of wealth was not just for vanity, it was a physical manifestation of their power, and a constant, visual reminder of the deep and unbridgeable chasm that separated them from the rest of society. Life in the court was not fast-paced but ceremonial. The days were filled with formal dinners, hunting expeditions, religious services, and the endless, intricate dance of political maneuvering. A simple conversation could be a moment of profound political importance, and a misplaced word could be a social death sentence. The atmosphere was one of polite, hushed formality, a world away from the chaotic noise of the city or the simple, earthy sounds of the village. Beneath this glittering, polished surface, the court was a place of immense tension. The courtiers, the advisors, the guards, they were not just there to serve, they were there to compete. They were a network of rivals, each one watching and waiting for a misstep, an opportunity to gain favour or to betray a rival. The court was a stage, but the performance was one of survival. The drama was not of physical hardship, but of psychological warfare, and the stakes were nothing less than power, favour, and sometimes a person's life. As we conclude our glimpse into the ceremonial world of the royal court, we can see that for all its glamour, it was a world of profound artifice and constant tension. In our next segment, we will delve deeper into the complex, strategic relationships that existed within this world, exploring the reality of marriage and the central, often invisible role of women in the great game of power. Within the gilded, formal halls of the royal court, personal relationships were rarely a matter of individual emotion. They were, instead, a fundamental part of the strategic game of power. For the medieval nobility, marriage was not about love or personal choice. It was a political tool, a business transaction, and a military alliance all rolled into one. It was a transaction that could unite kingdoms, end wars, and secure a family's legacy for generations. In this high-stakes game, noble women were not simply bystanders, they were the most valuable pieces on the chessboard. From a very young age, a noble daughter was a key asset. She would be trained not in the simple duties of a peasant, but in the complex skills required to be a strategic wife: diplomacy, languages, music, and the management of a vast household. Her value on the marriage market was directly tied to the land and wealth she would bring to her new family as part of her dowry. The dowry was a central component of the marriage negotiation. It was the land, money, or goods that a woman's family gave to her new husband's family upon her marriage. For a powerful, noble family, a large dowry was a way to secure a crucial alliance, to gain land, or to fund a military campaign. The size and richness of a dowry were a public statement of a family's wealth and influence, and the negotiations over it could last for years, involving detailed contracts and shrewd bargaining. The process of an arranged marriage was a long and public affair. Betrothals, a formal agreement to marry, were often arranged when the children were still infants or toddlers. These betrothals were a public announcement of a political alliance, and the children, in effect, were promised to each other long before they had any understanding of what marriage was. The betrothal was a powerful signal to rival families, a clear statement of a new political partnership. The reality of these marriages, when they finally occurred years or even decades later, was often stark. The bride and groom might meet for the first time at the wedding itself, two strangers bound together by a contract of land and power. The purpose of the marriage was clear and simple: to produce a male heir. A son was the crucial final piece of the strategic alliance, a way to ensure the family's line continued and the lands of both families were consolidated. For the woman, the pressure to produce a healthy son was immense, and a marriage that failed to produce an heir could be a personal and political disaster. Despite being treated as pawns in this political game, noble women often wielded a great deal of power within their own sphere. The management of a castle was a monumental task. A noblewoman was responsible for a household of hundreds of people, from the servants and cooks to the stable hands and guards. She managed the finances, oversaw the education of her children, and was a key player in the social and ceremonial life of the court. When her husband was away at war or on a diplomatic mission, she was often the de facto ruler of their lands, making decisions on everything from agriculture to justice. This gave her a level of authority and influence that was often overlooked but was essential to the functioning of the entire noble system. So, for all its pomp and circumstance, the glittering world of the court was a place of cold, calculated relationships. Marriage was not a matter of the heart, but a matter of the crown. It was a transaction that could secure the future of a family or a kingdom, and the lives of the noble men and women were shaped by this strategic game from the moment they were born. This was a world of power, but it was a power that was often wielded not through swords and battle, but through contracts, dowries, and the quiet, profound importance of a bloodline. As we conclude our look into the political marriages of the nobility, We will now turn our attention to one of the most lavish and ostentatious displays of this wealth and power. We'll leave the hushed world of contracts and alliances and enter the great hall, where the spectacle of a medieval feast, with its exotic foods, strange entertainments, and rigid social order, will take center stage. While the daily life of the court was governed by quiet ceremony and strategic calculation, there were moments of grand spectacle and social performance. The medieval feast was one such occasion. Stepping away from the hushed negotiation of marriage contracts, we now enter the great hall of a noble castle, a cavernous, echoing space that was the stage for a lavish and often ostentatious display of wealth and power. The great hall was a visual symphony of opulence. Banners and tapestries hung from the stone walls, muting the echoes and adding splashes of colour. A fire crackled in a large central hearth, casting a warm, flickering light that danced across the faces of the guests. A long, elevated table, known as the high table, was reserved for the most important guests, the lord, his family, and high-ranking nobles. The rest of the guests sat at long, sturdy tables that ran the length of the hall, a physical representation of the rigid social hierarchy of the medieval world. The food served at a feast was a direct, vibrant contrast to the monotonous diet of the common people. This was a time of immense excess. Courses would be brought out one after another in a seemingly endless procession. There were roasted wild boar, succulent venison, and large, magnificent birds like swans or peacocks, all cooked whole and often reassembled with their feathers intact to be paraded into the hall. The food was not just for eating, but for display. There were intricate sculpted pies, filled with spiced meat and eggs, and small sugary confections that were a testament to the skill of the cook. The etiquette of dining at a medieval feast would feel alien to us today. Forks had not yet become a common utensil. Guests ate primarily with their hands, using a personal knife to cut their food. The concept of a personal plate was also rare. Instead, food was served on a trencher, a thick slice of stale bread that would absorb the juices and sauces from the meal. The trencher was often given to the poor or the servants at the end of the feast. A guest's social status also dictated what they ate. The choicest cuts of meat and the most delicate dishes were served to the high table, while those at the lower tables received simpler, less prestigious fare. The drinking was as essential as the eating. Wine, ale, and mead flowed freely from large wooden casks. A communal cup would often be passed down the table, a practice that, while fostering a sense of community, was also a vector for the spread of germs. The feasting was a time for heavy drinking and boisterous revelry, a rare moment of release from the daily tension of noble life. Between the courses, entertainment would be provided. This was a feast for the ears as well as the stomach. Musicians would play lutes and harps, their music filling the great hall with melodies. Storytellers, or bards, would recount epic tales of legendary heroes and mythical beasts. Jesters, with their colourful motley and quick wit, would provide comic relief, their role to mock and entertain without fear of punishment. All of this was designed to create a spectacle to reinforce the power and grandeur of the host. The feast was a social event, a time for the nobles to see and be seen. But even in this atmosphere of feasting and merriment, the rules of the court were never far from the surface. A person's seat at the table, their proximity to the high table, and their interaction with the lord and lady were all subtle signals of their position within the intricate social web.
A toast to the wrong person could be a social misstep, and a quiet conversation with a rival could be a sign of a new alliance. As the fires died down and the remnants of the feast were cleared away, the great hall would slowly empty, the music fading into the long corridors. The feast was a powerful, fleeting display of wealth and power, a moment of excess that stood in stark contrast to the daily grind of the common people. But beneath the surface of the music and the wine, the feast was still a political stage, a place where a person's fortune could be won or lost with a single word or a subtle gesture. In our next segment, we will delve deeper into the darker, more dangerous side of this game, exploring the world of political intrigue and betrayal.
Beneath the glittering surface of the royal court, beyond the grand feasts and the ceremonial dances, existed a darker, more dangerous world. This was the world of political intrigue, a place where a single whisper could be more powerful than a sword, and where a person's fortune could turn on a single word. In this hushed environment of immense power and wealth, every noble and every courtier was a player in a relentless, unforgiving game of strategy and survival. The court was a place of constant, unspoken competition for the king's or the lord's favour. The proximity to power was everything. A person who could whisper a word of advice or a piece of valuable information into the ruler's ear held more sway than 100 soldiers on a battlefield. This created an atmosphere of intense rivalry, where a person's success was often built on the failure of their rivals. In this game, information was the most valuable currency. Spies and informants were a regular feature of court life, a network of eyes and ears that extended from the private chambers of the most powerful nobles to the kitchens of the lowliest servants. Knowing a rival's secrets, their debts, their vices, their private conversations was a powerful weapon that could be used to discredit them, to turn the ruler against them, or to orchestrate their downfall. The most skilled courtiers were not the best fighters or the most eloquent speakers, but the ones who knew how to listen, how to observe, and how to use information to their advantage. The art of a whisper was a deadly skill. A well-placed rumour, a subtle insinuation, or a veiled accusation could plant a seed of doubt in the mind of the ruler. There was no internet, no newspapers, and no way to quickly verify the truth. A story, once it had been whispered and repeated, could take on a life of its own, turning a loyal servant into a suspected traitor, or a powerful noble into a weak fool. A person's reputation, a fragile thing in the medieval world, could be destroyed with a single well-aimed falsehood. The consequences of losing favour were severe. A noble who fell out of favour with the ruler could be stripped of their titles, their lands, and their wealth. They might be banished from the court and sent into exile, a form of social and political death that removed them entirely from the centre of power. This was a fate that was often worse than death itself, a descent from the heights of wealth and influence to a life of quiet desperation and social insignificance. The ultimate act of betrayal was, of course, treason and assassination. While these events were rare, they were a terrifying reality of the court. A failed attempt to seize power could lead to a public execution, a brutal end that served as a grim warning to all who might be contemplating a similar move. Plots and conspiracies were a constant underlying fear, a silent war that was fought not with swords and arrows, but with poison, daggers, and carefully laid plans. Even the king or lord himself was not safe.
He was surrounded by people who were sworn to protect him, but who were also, in their own way, competing for his power. He had to be constantly on guard, constantly suspicious, and constantly aware that the person who smiled at him might be the one who would ultimately betray him. As the fires in the great hall die down and the last of the candles are extinguished, the quiet of the night is a fragile thing. For the nobles who inhabited this world, sleep was not always a peaceful refuge. It was a brief reprieve from a game that never truly ended, a game of power and betrayal that was fought in the shadows and where the stakes were nothing less than life, death, and the fate of a kingdom. With our exploration of the court complete, we will now turn to the most romanticized aspect of the medieval world, to the knights and the conflicts that defined their era. We will leave behind the quiet intrigues of the court and enter the loud, brutal, and often very messy world of warfare.
Having navigated the quiet psychological battlefields of the royal court, we now turn our attention to the physical warriors who were at the heart of the medieval era. This was a world that idealized courage, honor, and loyalty, a world defined by the code of chivalry and the image of the armored knight. But the path to becoming this figure was not an easy one. It was a long, arduous process, a life of relentless training and service that began in a boy's early childhood. The first step on this path was as a page. At the age of 7 or 8, a boy of noble birth would be sent away from his home to live in the castle of a lord, a noble of higher standing than his own father. Here he would begin his education. It was a rigorous and wide-ranging curriculum that focused on more than just military skills. He would learn basic literacy and numeracy, but his education was far more practical. He would learn how to ride a horse, a fundamental skill for a future warrior. He would also learn the courtly arts, how to play the lute, how to sing, and how to behave with courtesy and manners. But his primary role was to serve. He would act as a personal servant to the lord and lady of the castle, learning the intricate etiquette of the court and the day-to-day workings of the household. This was a period of service and learning designed to instill the discipline and humility that a future knight would need. The next stage on this path began around the age of 14, when the boy became a squire. This was the second and most demanding stage of his training. The squire was an assistant to a knight. His days were filled with a long list of duties that revolved around his knight's well-being and readiness for battle. He would be responsible for his knight's horse, grooming and feeding it every day. He would clean and polish the knight's armor, a heavy, laborious task that was a constant part of his routine. He would also be responsible for the knight's weapons, sharpening his swords and spears, and ensuring they were in perfect condition. But the squire was also a warrior in training. He would begin his serious military education, learning how to wield a sword and a lance. His training was not always against a live opponent. He would often practice against a quintain, a rotating dummy with a shield on one arm and a club on the other. His goal was to hit the shield with his lance without being struck by the club, a difficult task that taught him precision and timing. He would also practice on foot, learning how to fight with a sword and shield, and how to use the heavy, blunt force of a mace or a warhammer. The squire's training also took him to the front lines. He would accompany his knight to tournaments, acting as his shield-bearer and personal assistant, and learning the rules of combat and the spectacle of chivalry. But more importantly, he would accompany his knight to battle. Here he would be a non-combatant, but he would witness firsthand the chaos and brutality of warfare, learning the grim reality of conflict and the psychological toll it took. The long, hard path of a page and a squire culminated in the moment of knighthood. This was a deeply sacred and ceremonial event. The candidate would spend a night of silent vigil in a chapel, praying and fasting. The next day, in a solemn ceremony, he would kneel before a king or a high-ranking lord. The lord would tap him on the shoulder with a sword and utter the words, "Arise, sir, name." This simple act, known as dubbing, was a profound transformation, a public declaration of the boy's new status and his new responsibilities. From that moment on, he was a knight, a member of a new exclusive brotherhood. He was expected to live by the code of chivalry, a set of ideals that included loyalty to his lord, protection of the weak, and courage in battle. He was a mounted warrior, a key figure in the armies of the medieval era. The making of a knight was a long, brutal process, a testament to the importance of military skill in a world where land, power, and even a person's life were often won and lost on the battlefield. This arduous training produced the finest warriors of their time, but their true test came not in the quiet halls of a castle or on the practice fields, but in the brutal reality of war. In our next segment, we will leave the world of training and ceremony behind and enter the loud, violent, and chaotic world of medieval conflict. The path to knighthood was one of honor and ceremony, a long-held ideal of courage and chivalry. But the destination of this path was a place of chaos, fear, and unimaginable brutality. This was the medieval battlefield, a far cry from the glorious, choreographed duels of the stories. It was a loud, bloody, and terrifying reality, where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. A medieval battle began with a roar, a deafening sound of clashing metal, 1,000 voices shouting, and the thunder of galloping horses. The battlefield itself was often a muddy, uneven field, a landscape of treacherous terrain and hidden dangers. It was not a place of individual glory, but a mass of humanity locked in a brutal, pushing and shoving crush. The famous cavalry charge, with its images of gleaming knights on powerful steeds, was often a brief moment of overwhelming force, followed by a long, exhausting, and chaotic melee on foot. The knight's armor, his symbol of status and his protection, was both a blessing and a curse. A full suit of plate armor could weigh over 50 pounds. It was hot, it was restrictive, and it was a physical ordeal to wear for a long period of time. Inside his steel shell, the knight was relatively safe from an arrow or a sword cut, but he was not invincible. A mace, a hammer, or a heavy poleaxe could crush and shatter the armor underneath, a kind of blunt force trauma that was just as deadly as a blade. The fighting was not about finesse, but about brute strength, about finding a weak point in the armor, a gap at the joints, or simply exhausting your opponent until he could no longer stand. But medieval warfare was not just about open field battles. It was, for the most part, a war of attrition, a long and brutal process of siege warfare. The great stone castles, with their thick walls and towering keeps, were formidable fortresses. A direct assault on a castle was almost always a fool's errand. Instead, the besiegers would set up a siege,
a long, drawn-out period of a slow, grinding war. The primary goal of a siege was either to starve the defenders into submission or to breach the castle walls. For this, the besiegers would use a variety of terrifying, ingenious machines. The trebuchet, a massive siege engine that worked on the principle of a counterweight, could hurl heavy stones, fire, or even the carcasses of diseased animals at the castle walls, a psychological and physical assault that could last for months. The battering ram, a heavy, log-like beam, was used to repeatedly smash against the castle's gates, a slow, methodical effort to break them down. Inside the besieged castle, life was a different kind of hell. The food supplies would slowly begin to dwindle. The water might be cut off or poisoned. The defenders, living in a constant state of fear and anxiety, would often be forced to make a grim choice between starvation or a desperate, often suicidal charge against the besiegers. The knights and nobles who led these conflicts were a minority. The vast majority of the fighting force was made up of common soldiers, farmers and labourers who had been conscripted into the army. They had little to no armour, and their weapons were often simple spears, bows and axes. For them, the battlefield was not a place of honour, but a place of sheer terror, a chaotic slaughter where a person's life could be ended in a single brutal moment. After a battle was over, the battlefield was a gruesome spectacle. The wounded would be left to die or be tended to by crude barber surgeons. The dead, both knight and common soldier, would be stripped of their armour, their weapons, and any valuables they had. This was a grim form of profit for the victors, a final indignity for the fallen. The long, bloody shadow of battle and siege warfare was a constant presence in the medieval world, a brutal and unromantic reality that defined an entire era. It was a world where a person's survival was never guaranteed, and where the most lasting legacy of a war was often the long, empty silence that followed. In our next segment, we will delve deeper into the day-to-day life inside the castles that were the centre of all this conflict. From the chaos of the battlefield and the brutal efficiency of a siege, our focus now narrows to the world within the stone walls of a medieval castle. It is easy to see a castle only as a fortress, a symbol of military power and impregnability. But for the hundreds of people who called it home, it was a living, breathing community. A miniature city with its own rules, its own society, and its own daily rhythm of life. The castle was a vertical and horizontal stack of different functions, a complex machine that was designed to be both a home and a military stronghold. The first line of defence was the bailey, the large courtyard enclosed by the outer walls. This was the most bustling part of the castle, a space filled with workshops for blacksmiths and carpenters, stables for horses, and barracks for the soldiers. Here, the day-to-day work of keeping the castle running would unfold, a constant hum of activity that provided for the castle's needs. At the heart of the castle's social life was the Great Hall. This was the large, echoing space where the lord would hold his court, where the entire household would gather for meals, and where the justice of the manor was dispensed. It was a public and multifunctional space, a testament to a time when a person's private and public life were not so clearly separated. The Great Hall was where the castle's social hierarchy was most visible, with the lord and lady seated at the high table and the rest of the household seated below them in a clear order of precedence. The most fortified part of the castle was the keep, the central, towering stone fortress. This was the lord's final refuge in a siege. Inside, it contained his private chambers, his bedchamber, and his treasury. These were the only truly private spaces in the entire castle, a place where the lord and his family could retreat from the constant public life of the great hall. The keep was a place of immense security, its thick walls and small windows a final, powerful symbol of the lord's absolute power and authority. The population of a castle was a diverse cross-section of society. At the very top were the lord and lady, the absolute rulers of the castle. Below them were the knights and soldiers, the military force that protected the castle and its surrounding lands. There were also the clerics and scribes, who maintained the castle's records and administered to its spiritual needs. But the vast majority of the castle's inhabitants were its servants, the cooks who worked in the hot, smoky kitchens, the stable hands who tended to the horses, the laundresses, the blacksmiths, the carpenters, and a host of other labourers who kept the castle functioning on a daily basis. A day inside the castle was a life of constant routine and specific duties. The work began at dawn with the blowing of a horn to awaken the household. The day was filled with a host of tasks, from cleaning the great hall and preparing meals, to military training in the bailey and administrative work in the lord's chambers. The evenings were a time for a communal meal, followed by music, storytelling, and a brief period of rest before the long, silent night. For all its grandeur and military might, a castle was not a comfortable place by modern standards. It was often cold, damp, and draughty, with a constant lack of privacy. The toilets, known as guardrobes, were simple shafts built into the walls that emptied directly into the moat or the ditch below. The sanitation was poor, and the health of the castle's inhabitants was always at risk. The sheer volume of people living in such close proximity meant that disease could spread with terrifying speed. The castle was more than just a home or a fortress. It was the very heart of the feudal system. It was a symbol of the lord's power, a military stronghold that protected his lands and his people, and a social centre where the intricate drama of medieval life, from feast to betrayal, would unfold. It was a world that was defined by its walls, a self-contained universe that was both a sanctuary and a prison. In our final journey through the medieval era, we will see how this world, this era of knights and castles, would eventually come to an end, swept away by a powerful new force that would render the thick stone walls and the heavy suits of armour obsolete.
The castle, with its thick stone walls and towering keeps, stood as the ultimate symbol of the medieval era, a fortress of permanence and power. But in the late Middle Ages, a new and powerful force, a force that was dark, loud, and utterly destructive, would arrive from the east. This was the era of the knight, the castle, and feudal power, and it was about to meet its end not with a final glorious battle, but with a whisper of smoke and the deafening roar of a new invention, gunpowder. Gunpowder, a mysterious compound of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, was first introduced to Europe from China. Its initial use was crude and experimental. Early firearms were little more than small cannons, difficult to load, wildly inaccurate, and as dangerous to the person firing them as they were to the enemy. For a long time, the bow and the crossbow were considered far more reliable and effective weapons. The knight, in his heavy armour, still dominated the battlefield, and the castle, with its thick walls, was still impregnable. But over time, the technology of gunpowder began to evolve. The small handheld firearms became more reliable, and the true power of gunpowder was harnessed in a new kind of weapon, the cannon. These massive bronze or iron tubes, which fired huge stone or iron balls with immense force, were a complete game changer. For centuries, the siege of a castle was a long, brutal, and often unsuccessful affair. The siege engines of old, like the trebuchet and the battering ram, were slow and inefficient. A castle could withstand a siege for years. The cannon, however, was a different kind of force. A single cannonball, fired with the immense power of gunpowder, could shatter a stone wall that had stood for generations. The noise of a cannon, a deafening thunder that shook the very foundations of the castle, was not just a physical threat, but a psychological one. The days of the long, drawn-out siege were over. A castle, which had once been a symbol of impregnability, could now be breached in a matter of days or even hours. The age of the fortress was over, and the era of the artillery fortresses, with their low, thick, angled walls, began. This new technology also marked the beginning of the end for the knight. The heavily armored knight, the master of close-quarters combat, was now a slow, vulnerable target. A cannonball or a musket ball, fired from a distance, could punch through his armor, rendering his years of training and his expensive equipment obsolete. The battlefield was no longer a place for individual prowess and chivalric codes. It was a place for disciplined formations of soldiers, armed with firearms who could deliver a devastating volley of fire from a distance. The power of the knight, which had been the military backbone of the feudal system, began to wane, and a new kind of warfare, a modern warfare, was born. The end of the castle and the knight had a profound effect on the political landscape of Europe. With the power of a single lord to hold his castle against a king's army now gone, the balance of power shifted. Centralized monarchies, with their vast resources, were the only ones who could afford the new, expensive artillery. This gave them the power to consolidate their rule, to crush rebellious nobles, and to build the foundations of the modern nation-state. The medieval era was a long, complex, and fascinating tapestry of life. We have traveled from the quiet, grinding existence of the peasant to the chaotic energy of the city, to the dark shadows of plague and superstition, to the gilded intrigues of the court, and finally to the brutal, romanticized world of the knight. It was a world defined by the land, by the sword, by faith, and by a constant struggle for survival. But with the invention of a simple dark powder, this world began to crumble. The power of the church, the might of the knight, and the impregnability of the castle all began to fade, giving way to a new era of science, commerce, and innovation. The medieval era, defined by the land, the sword, and the enduring castle, was now beginning to crumble. The power of the knight, which had been the military backbone of the feudal system, began to wane, and a new kind of warfare, a modern warfare, was born. The medieval era, defined by the land, the sword, and the enduring castle, was now beginning to crumble. The power of the knight, which had been the military backbone of the feudal system, began to wane, and a new kind of warfare, a modern warfare, was born. As the great era of knights and castles began to wane, giving way to new technologies of war, another, quieter force remained a constant presence throughout the Middle Ages. This was the world of art and craftsmanship. In a time when the vast majority of the population could not read or write, art was not just a form of beauty, it was a language, a powerful medium for telling stories, for preserving knowledge, and for communicating the deepest beliefs of the medieval mind. Two of the most enduring and beautiful forms of art from this period were the illuminated manuscript and the stained glass window.
Both were a testament to the immense skill, patience, and devotion of the medieval artisan, a figure who often worked in quiet anonymity for the glory of God and their craft. The creation of an illuminated manuscript was a long, painstaking, and collaborative process. These were not just books, they were works of art, handwritten and meticulously decorated, often taking years to complete. The first stage belonged to the scribe, a person who would copy the text, usually from the Bible or a religious text, by hand. The work of the scribe was a slow, deliberate act of precision, a quiet dedication to preserving a sacred text. They would sit at a desk, their quill moving carefully over the page, their concentration absolute. After the text was written, the manuscript would be passed to the illuminator. This was the artist, the one who would bring the pages to life with color and gold. The most striking feature of these books was the use of gold leaf, which was hammered into impossibly thin sheets and then applied to the pages. The gold would catch the light, making the pages literally illuminated, a powerful visual metaphor for the divine light of the Word. The illuminator would also use a wide array of vibrant pigments derived from crushed minerals like lapis lazuli for blue and malachite for green, or from plants and insects. These were incredibly expensive materials, and their use in a single book was a sign of immense wealth and devotion. The illuminations themselves were not just decorations, they were intricate pictures that told a story, illustrating a passage of scripture or depicting a saint. The second great art form of the medieval era was the stained glass window. If the illuminated manuscript was the book of the wealthy, then the stained glass window was the Bible of the poor. In a time when most people could not read, a cathedral's windows were a visual sermon. The scenes depicted in the glass, stories from the life of Christ, the lives of the saints, or the parables of the Bible, told a narrative that was accessible to everyone, a brilliant, colorful lesson in faith. The process of creating these windows was a beautiful, difficult craft. Glass blowers would create sheets of glass, which were then colored with metallic oxides. The glass was then cut into small, intricate pieces, a puzzle of light and color. These pieces were held together by thin strips of lead, which also served as the black outlines that defined the figures and shapes. When the sun streamed through these windows, the colors would explode into a kaleidoscope of light, filling the vast, dark interior of the cathedral with a magical, ethereal glow. The light, for the medieval person, was a powerful, symbolic representation of the divine, a physical manifestation of a higher power. The medieval artist, whether a scribe, an illuminator, or a glazier, was not seen as an individual genius. They were artisans, craftsmen who were masters of their trade. Their work was not about personal fame or individual expression. It was about the perfection of their craft, a quiet dedication to creating something beautiful and functional for the glory of God. Their names are often lost to history, but their works remain, a testament to a world that valued patience, meticulous detail, and an unwavering belief that art was a sacred act. As we conclude this journey into the art of the Middle Ages, we can see that this was not a dark and ignorant time, but an era of immense artistic creation, where the pursuit of beauty and the preservation of knowledge was seen as a holy duty. This careful, structured mind that created these beautiful works also turned its attention to the world of nature and the mysteries of the universe, but with a worldview that was entirely different from our own. In our next segment, we will delve into this world, exploring the strange and fascinating practices of the alchemist and the astrologer.
If art in the Middle Ages was a reflection of faith and beauty, then the era's science was a different, more mysterious pursuit, a quest to understand the secrets of the universe through a combination of ancient knowledge, philosophical thought, and a good deal of superstition. This was a world without the scientific method, a world where the lines between chemistry and magic were blurred, and where the natural world was a puzzle to be unlocked not through experimentation, but through the strange and fascinating practices of the alchemist and the astrologer. The most famous of these medieval proto-scientists was the alchemist. In his quiet, smoke-filled laboratory, surrounded by bizarre-looking glassware and bubbling concoctions, the alchemist pursued two primary and often impossible goals. The first was to find a way to transmute base metals like lead or copper into gold. The second and more profound quest was to discover the elixir of life, a magical potion that was believed to cure all diseases and grant the drinker immortality. The work of the alchemist was a strange and complex series of processes. They would use a variety of tools, such as the alembic and the retort, to heat and distill various substances, watching for subtle changes in colour and texture. They believed that by purifying and refining a substance through a series of chemical reactions, they could transform it into something of a higher, more perfect state. While their ultimate goals were never achieved, the alchemists, in their search for gold and immortality, made important discoveries in chemistry. They learned how to distill alcohol, how to create new compounds, and how to work with various metals, laying a crucial foundation for the development of modern chemistry. The second major scientific pursuit of the medieval mind was astrology, the belief that the movements and positions of the stars and planets could influence events on Earth and the lives of individuals. Astrology was not seen as a frivolous pursuit. It was a respected and serious field of study, and its principles were integrated into nearly every aspect of medieval life. A king would consult his royal astrologer before making a major political decision or going to war. A farmer would look to the stars to determine the best time to plant his crops. Even in the realm of medicine, astrology played a central role. A physician would consult a patient's astrological chart to determine the best time to administer a treatment or perform a bloodletting. The belief was that the human body, just like the Earth, was a microcosm of the cosmos, and that the position of the planets could affect the balance of the body's four humours. This medieval worldview was shaped by the ancient Greek philosophers and the teachings of the Church. The prevailing view of the cosmos was geocentric, the belief that the Earth was a stationary object at the centre of the universe, with the sun, moon, and planets all revolving around it. This view, which was first put forth by the astronomer Ptolemy, was in line with the teachings of the Church, which held that humanity was the centre of God's creation. The relationship between the Church and this new, emerging science was complex. While the Church sometimes viewed with suspicion those who practiced forms of magic and sorcery, it was also the primary patron of learning and philosophy. The great minds of the Middle Ages, many of whom were clerics, studied and translated the ancient texts of the Greeks and Romans, preserving and building upon the knowledge of the past. The universities, which began to emerge in the late Middle Ages, were often founded under the patronage of the Church, serving as the centres of this intellectual pursuit. As we conclude our look into the medieval mind,
we can see that this was not a time of complete scientific ignorance. It was a time of curiosity, of experimentation, and of a deep-seated belief that the universe was a mysterious, ordered place with a deeper meaning that could be unlocked by those who were willing to look for it. The methods of the alchemist and the astrologer may seem strange to us today, but their work was a crucial, necessary step on the long, winding road that would eventually lead to the birth of modern science. In our next segment, we will leave the smoke-filled labs and turn our attention to the places where all of this knowledge was gathered and preserved, the monastery. If the alchemist's quest for knowledge was a solitary, mysterious pursuit, then the monk's life was its communal and disciplined opposite. From the smoke-filled labs and the winding streets of the city, we now turn our attention to the quiet, peaceful world of the monastery, a self-sufficient community of men or women who had dedicated their lives to God. In a chaotic world of constant warfare, famine, and disease, the monastery stood as a place of order, a hub of spiritual devotion, and a crucial beacon of knowledge and learning. The life of a monk or nun was one of strict routine and unwavering discipline, a life governed by the tolling of a bell. This schedule, known as the horarium, dictated every hour of their day, from before dawn until well into the night. Their time was divided into periods of communal prayer, private study and reflection, and a variety of manual labor that made the monastery a self-sufficient community. A monk might spend his morning in prayer, his afternoon in the fields tending to the crops, and his evening in the scriptorium, a quiet, holy space where the most important work of the monastery took place. The scriptorium was the heart of the monastic intellectual life. In a time when books were a rare and precious commodity, it was here that knowledge was preserved. Monks would sit at their desks, meticulously copying ancient texts by hand. The work was painstaking, requiring immense patience and a steady hand. They would copy not only the sacred texts of the Bible, but also the works of the great ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, writers, and scientists. Without the quiet, diligent work of these monks, much of the classical knowledge that was the foundation of our modern world would have been lost forever. The monastic library, with its rows of carefully copied and bound books, was often the largest collection of knowledge in the medieval world. The monastery's influence extended far beyond its walls. They were often pioneers of new agricultural techniques, with their vast lands serving as models for farming and animal husbandry. They maintained their own infirmaries, where they cared for their sick and injured, and cultivated extensive herb gardens with a variety of medicinal plants. This made the monastery a kind of early hospital for the community, a place where the sick could find a degree of medical care that was often unavailable elsewhere. The monastery also played a vital role in the hospitality of the medieval world. With roads often dangerous and inns few and far between, a monastery was often the only place where a traveller could find safe lodging for a night. A weary pilgrim, a travelling merchant, or even a knight on a journey would be offered a bed and a meal, a hospitality that was considered a sacred duty. The men and women who chose this life did so by taking a series of powerful vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. They renounced all personal possessions, committed to a life of celibacy, and swore to obey the rule of their abbot or abbess. Their lives were a quiet, constant act of devotion, a pursuit of a spiritual perfection that stood in sharp contrast to the worldly concerns of the knight and the merchant. As we conclude our glimpse into the peaceful, ordered life of the monastery, we can see that these quiet, disciplined communities were a vital force for stability, learning, and charity in a world that was often violent and unpredictable. Their dedication to the preservation of knowledge and their role as a social and spiritual anchor were a fundamental part of the medieval mind. But for all the quiet devotion of the monk, the medieval world also had its moments of boisterous, noisy, and often very simple pleasures. In our final segment, we will turn our attention to the leisure and entertainment of the Middle Ages, a time of games, feasts, and merriment that provided a much-needed release from the struggles of daily life. From the quiet, disciplined world of the monastery, we now turn our attention to the loud, boisterous, and often very simple pleasures of the medieval world. For all the hardship, the constant labour, and the ever-present threat of disease and famine, the medieval person was not without joy. They found respite and happiness in a variety of games and entertainments, a necessary release that helped them endure the challenges of their lives. For the common people, leisure was often a communal affair, tied to the agricultural calendar and the religious festivals. The most significant celebrations were often after a successful harvest, a time of great relief and joy. During these festivals, entire villages would gather in the square, sharing what little extra food and drink they had. There would be music from simple pipes and drums, dancing, and a general atmosphere of merriment. These were moments when the rigid social order of the day would briefly give way to a shared sense of community, a collective moment of gratitude and release. Simple games were also a popular form of entertainment. Children and adults alike would play with dice, a game of chance that could be a source of a quick coin or a small, bitter loss. Board games, such as Nine Men's Morris or a simple form of chess, were popular pastimes, played in the quiet of an evening, in the flickering light of the hearth fire. Various ball games, often rough and without formal rules, were played in the fields, a way to blow off steam and engage in friendly competition. Storytelling and music were a central part of this world. The travelling minstrel was a welcome guest in any village, bringing with him news from distant lands, epic tales of heroes, and new songs that would be passed down from mouth to mouth. For the nobility, entertainment was on a grander, more spectacular scale. The most famous of these entertainments was the tournament, a series of mock battles that were both a sport and a form of military training. The tournament was a massive spectacle, attracting knights from all over the kingdom and drawing huge crowds. The centerpiece of the tournament was the joust, a one-on-one combat where two knights on horseback, armed with lances, would charge at each other with the goal of unhorsing their opponent. The tournament was a celebration of chivalry and a stage for a knight to prove his courage and skill, and the winner would be awarded with a prize and a great deal of fame. Hunting was another popular pastime for the nobility. This was not just for food, but for sport. The lord would lead a large party into the forest with dogs and hunters. Falconry, the sport of hunting with trained falcons, was a highly specialized and expensive form of hunting that was reserved for the highest-ranking nobles. A well-trained falcon was a sign of immense wealth and status. Inside the castle, the entertainment was more refined. The long, silent hours were often filled with music from harps and lutes. The nobles would play board games like chess and backgammon, games of strategy that were a form of mental exercise. Storytelling was also a major part of court life, with a professional bard or storyteller recounting tales of great heroes, mythical beasts, and romantic love. This was a world that, for all its hardships, knew how to celebrate. Whether it was the quiet joy of a simple board game in a peasant's hut, or the deafening roar of a crowd at a knight's joust, the medieval person found joy in the simple pleasures of life. They were a people who, in the face of constant struggles, found a way to laugh, to sing, and to dance, a testament to the enduring and indomitable nature of the human spirit. With this final glimpse into the leisure and entertainment of the Middle Ages, Our long journey through this fascinating and complex era now comes to a close. We have travelled from the quiet, dark mornings of the peasant's hut to the boisterous spectacle of the tournament. We have witnessed the strange world of the alchemist and the brutal reality of the battlefield. The medieval world was a place of immense hardship and profound beauty, a time of great faith and terrifying disease, of simple lives and powerful intrigues. All of these threads, these small human stories, are now a part of our shared past, a long, quiet story that, in the stillness of the night, is finally laid to rest.